and welcome to our Facebook Live and of course our Zoom friends and those who are tuning in on YouTube. So today's discussion, my dear friends, is the continuing series on getting better at being you. And today's title is Extreme Responsibility. And I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by both of those terms, because both are very important for us to engage and navigate today's information. The idea of this class has always been with me, and I've spoken about it in different forms at different times. But there was a book I read. I purchased it a little while ago. It was a New York Times bestseller. I actually have it over here. It's going to be backwards for the people on Instagram and Facebook, and pretty okay for those on Zoom because of the reverse nature of things. But it's called Extreme Ownership. How US Navy SEALs Lead and Win. And it's written by two now very famous authors who've been interviewed extensively on this, do a lot of training in this, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. So this is the book, and it's a fascinating book that speaks about their time serving as leaders of Navy SEALs in Iraq, and their time and experience there. And there's a lot of premises to the book, but there's one idea which really resonated with me when I was reading this book. I'm going to read it one small piece to you, and then I'm going to engage and tell you why I called this class Extreme Responsibility, because they use the expression ownership, and the idea being that we are expected to own up in a big way to our responsibilities, and how we live and what we do is really going to be the secret to our success. And that's going to be the premise of today's talk. But I want to quote just two short paragraphs, which I don't do too often when I give classes, but their words are very, very impressive and have a lot of Jewish resonance, which we're going to look into today. They talk about the principle of that on any team, in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. They are strong believers that there are no bad teams, only bad leaders and bad leadership. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures. And that's a big premise of this particular book that we're discussing, Extreme Ownership. And take ownership of them and develop a plan to win. These are almost prophetic words. I'll explain why in a moment. The best leaders don't just take responsibility for their job. They take extreme ownership of everything that impacts their mission. The fundamental core concepts enable SEAL leaders, which is where they're coming from, to lead high-performing teams in extraordinary circumstances and win. Because we want to win, right? We don't lose. But extreme ownership isn't a principle whose application is limited to the battlefield. This concept is the number one characteristic of any high-performance winning team in any military unit, organization, sports team, business team, industry, and today's class, people and nation. Because a strong principle, as our friends Jocko Willink and Leif Babin talk about, taking responsibility, taking extreme ownership. And for us, the Jewish people, we're going to look at some examples of people who have taken extreme responsibility. That's going to be our mission in today's class, my dear friends. Let's start at the beginning. And let's go, if you don't mind, to the Garden of Eden. Because we know in the Garden of Eden, we learn that for leadership to be effective, there has to be responsibility. And there's a shift from the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, of the book of Genesis, to the beginning of Shemot, Exodus. And the difference is quite stark and very, very telling. And it goes like this. God called out to man, Adam, after they ate from the tree of good and evil, the tree of knowledge, of wisdom. And they said, where are you? Ayeka. How did you end up doing this? I told you not to do one thing. You were responsible for one thing and one thing only. And that one thing was to not eat from the forbidden fruit of the tree. What did Adam do? He said, it wasn't me. It was the woman. You gave me Chava, this woman. She gave me of the tree and ate. So God turns around to Eve and he asks her the same question. What have you done? Now, God obviously knows what they had done. But just like our authors say in Extreme Ownership, to be successful, you need to take ownership not only of your mission, but of your mistakes and failures. And Adam and Eve give up on that. And instead of owning up to her mistake, Eve says, it wasn't me. It was the Nachash. It was the snake. The snake that you put in the garden. He persuaded me to eat from the tree. So from our very early beginnings, we see that people are not taking responsibility and ownership over their unique missions. What happens to Adam and Eve? They get pushed out. They lose. And they become outsiders. We have the same problem with Cain and Abel, their descendants. We know that Cain killed Abel. Cain killed Hevel. And God called out to him and said, Ayecha, where is your brother? Where's your brother Abel? God knows where Abel was. And yet Cain responded with a very unusual verse, one of the most famous verses in the Bible, and said, Hashomer achi anochi? Am I my brother's keeper? That is a biblical way of saying, am I responsible for him? Is he on my own? What's it going to do with me? I have no ownership over him. He's his own person. What he did is what he did. What I did was what I did. And that was the end of it. Interestingly, God doesn't answer him. What should God have answered the question, am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for my brother? He should have said, yeah, actually you are. You made a big, big mistake. You killed him. Your responsibility was to work together with him and not against him. And yet God doesn't answer that. It's left as a question. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a great rabbi, lived in Germany in the last century, says something very fascinating, in the 1800s. He says something fascinating. He says it had to be left open as a question and not answered. Am I my brother's keeper? Because had God answered Cain and said, yes, you are, we would have mistakenly thought that only Cain was responsible for his brother. So God couldn't answer Cain directly. Instead, it's left as a question so that every person who reads this story, every generation that looks at the episode of Cain and Abel is going to have to ask themselves that question and answer it themselves. That they are responsible one for the other. So the book of Genesis is lack of responsibility, and the shift and the movement into the book of Exodus is finding responsibility. And that obviously opens up with Moshe Rabbeinu Moses, who when he sees one of his brothers being beaten and tortured, about to be killed by an Egyptian, stands up and says in the book of Exodus chapter 2 verse 11, Moses was grown up, he went out to his brothers, he felt connected. Unlike Cain, who felt no connection or responsibility, he said no. He saw what was happening to him. He saw the Egyptian hitting a Hebrew, one of his brothers. He turned this way and that way. He saw that no one else was willing to take responsibility. Moses stepped forth, helped his brother, and killed the Egyptian. From that one act, Moses was forced to flee from Pharaoh and could not join the Jewish people for decades. Till he was the age of 80 years old, he couldn't come back. We're talking today about responsibility. Responsibility is when we feel an obligation to go out of ourselves, to not follow Cain and Abel, but to follow Moses and others that we're going to talk about, and take on responsibility for others. Now, taking responsibility takes on many forms. Sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's enjoyable. I'm responsible for my kids sometimes, and I'll take him out for ice cream. I'm responsible for the people I work with, for my staff, and it's enjoyable. But sometimes responsibility is going to take a form. And the form it's going to take is of the form that we just spoke about a moment ago. It's extreme. It's big. It's larger than life. It's an extreme form where your entire life is about to be overtaken by this extreme responsibility that nothing is ever going to be the same again. Moses killed that Egyptian. His life was never the same again. Adam and Eve refused a responsibility. Their life was never the same again. Let's jump a little bit further and let's look at the words of a great leader by the name of Winston Churchill, who says, the price of greatness is responsibility. Now, he is someone who took extreme responsibility during the Second World War to bring around a great event, of course, for the Jewish people. Let's talk, however, about the upcoming holiday, because I don't know many stories in scriptures, if we want to talk about extreme responsibility, that match what Mordechai and Esther went through in the days of Achashverosh between the first and second temple period. Because if we're going to talk about extreme responsibility, Moses was an example of it, and Abraham was too, and so was Jacob and Isaac as well. But the people who personify this idea for taking extreme responsibility for their entire people on their shoulders is Mordechai and Esther. And the main thing I want to share with you today is that taking responsibility can be fun and enjoyable, but sometimes it's extremely unpleasant and very uneasy. And yet, many times in our lives, that responsibility is going to come our ways. Let's follow the pattern, the path of Mordechai and Esther as they navigated their way through the extreme responsibility that came upon them to save the Jewish people. We know that the Jewish people were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, and they found themselves in Bavel, modern-day Iraq. And then many people either moved or found themselves in Persia under the leadership of Achashverosh. And Achashverosh, we know, he may not appear this way in the Megillah, because the Megillah had to be written in a coded fashion, because after the story had finished, Achashverosh was still alive, and the book of Esther was presented to him. And therefore, Achashverosh does not appear this way, but he was a paranoid, extreme dictator. And those people who follow my classes before, a classic narcissist, like in every way. He checked every box of narcissism. That's our Achashverosh. And he kills his wife because she did not give him enough honor and defied his rule. A classic move of any great narcissist who has dictatorial powers. And he chooses a woman called Esther. Now, what's important over here is that Esther did not want this mission. She did not want to be chosen. And the Megillah hints at this. It couldn't tell us explicitly because Achashverosh would have been upset by this. But Esther and Mordechai wrote inside the Megillah the words, V'tilakach Esther. Esther was taken against her will in order to be a potential and then eventual wife of Achashverosh. So she is hauled away from her home. Some people say married to her cousin Mordechai. Some say she was just living in his home because she was an orphan. And she found herself in the palace. And Achashverosh took her against her will, spent the night with her, and decided that she was to become the one who would be his wife for the end of time. And that's where the story becomes extreme for Esther. You know, you read the Megillah and you think of Esther as a beautiful queen, walking around the palace with her beautiful robes. My friends, make no mistake. Esther was mortified that she had to go through this evil and extreme experience at the hands of this megalomaniac, paranoid, insane individual called Achashverosh. There wasn't a night of Esther in the palace where she didn't cry, although she well knew that the extreme responsibility that had laid itself before her and Mordechai's feet. And they were extremely pained at this. And Mordechai and Esther had to devise a plan to save the Jewish people, to fulfill the extreme responsibility that they were going to have to fulfill dealing with Achashverosh and destroying Haman. And the book of Esther tells us, chapter 2, verse 5 to 8, and a Jewish man, his name was Mordechai, he adopted his uncle's daughter, his cousin. When her parents had died, he took responsibility for her. That was a responsibility. That's understood. But she was a very beautiful woman. And the Megillah tells us this to hint us that part of her mission was going to be her tremendous beauty. Some people are given great brains to help them fulfill their mission. Some people are given charisma. Some people are given great mathematical abilities, great business abilities, great chesed abilities, whatever it is. Mordechai's abilities, we're going to see, was extreme bravery and beauty. Her beauty was one of the reasons she was chosen by Achashverosh, as well as a tremendous chen, the grace that she carried around with her. And she was taken into the palace. Now, we know the story. I won't go through it again. I gave a 3-part series already on it. You can look into it. But there gets a point where Haman's decree becomes accepted by Achashverosh, and the decree was that the Jewish people in 127 lands are going to have to be wiped out by whoever wants to kill them, and whoever kills them can take all their money. And Mordechai realized that this was the reason Esther had been placed in the palace. And so the beginning of their extreme responsibility, and this is the mission in their life that is going to really be the essence of who they are, and us as well, because we're going to read and learn from this story, is that now Mordechai and Esther have to devise a plan to kill Haman, number one, and to kill his decree, number two. And those were two very distinct and unique missions that they had become responsible for. And so Mordechai says to Esther, you better go in, and you now have to tell Achashverosh that you are Jewish, because she had hidden her origins from him, and tell him that you're a Jew, and that Haman wants to kill you and all of your people, your family and your friends and your entire nation. Now Esther turns around and says, no, I can't go in. There's a law in the land that everyone knows, that in order to see Achashverosh and walk into the palace to his inner chamber, you need to have 30 days permission. And I haven't had 30 days permission. Why did Achashverosh create such a strange law that you need 30 days permission in order to see him face to face? Well, there had been assassination attempts against him. And potentially there were going to be many, many more. And so Achashverosh made a law saying you're going to have a 30-day CIA FBI check before you come and see me. You can't just walk in whatever you want. Right, put a petition in, we'll get back to you. And Esther, his wife, was subject to the same law. And so what happens? Mordechai has to persuade Esther to go in on this suicide mission. Esther says no. Mordechai then tells her 3 things. And these 3 things, I believe, are the 3 most important factors that we need to remember when it comes to those moments in our lives, that if we have these moments, not going to happen to everyone, but those who go through this will go through this, when they need to take upon themselves extreme responsibility for themselves, their friends, their family, their people, their company, or whatever. And the 3 things he say are the following. He says, do not imagine you'll be able to escape in the king's palace any more than the rest of the Jews. That's 1. If you persist in keeping silence at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place. That's point number 2. And number 3, who knows whether it was for such a time that you attained the royal position. That's number 3. What are the 3 things Mordechai is persuading Esther and all of us when it comes to taking extremely unpleasant, and in this case, dangerous, almost suicidal, extreme responsibility? Number 1, don't think just because you're rich and famous and a well-known character in society that you are going to get killed as well. Don't think that just because you're a fancy person, don't think because you're the higher echelons of German society in the 1930s or American society in 2021, that when bad things happen to your people, they're not going to happen to you as well. That's number one. Don't think that your money, your honor, your prestige are going to save you. Take responsibility. Number two, don't think that the matter is dependent upon you. Because we have a guarantee. Mordechai was telling Esther that this company, this thing called the Jewish people, are always going to be around. They're always going to be there. There was a promise given to Avram and to Yitzchak and to Yaakov. So you don't think that the whole matter is dependent upon you. And if you don't step up right now and take extreme responsibility for your mission to save the Jewish people, God will find someone else. And you and your entire house, your family, are going to be forgotten. And it won't be Megillat Esther. It'll be Megillat Shoshana, Megillat Emily, Barbara, whatever. And finally, and this is, I consider to be the most scariest responsibilities that Mordechai throws on Esther and us. He says, your life has come down to this moment. Everything that's happened to you up to this point, and everything that's going to happen to you from this point, is based upon this one decision. Are you going to take responsibility for your people right now? Because this is your mission. No one else at this moment can do this except you. Your entire life, imagine that. Your entire life comes down to one decision. And I think those people who have lived long enough will look back at their lives and think back to a moment where, had I chosen that friendship instead of that friendship, I went to that place, met that person, my life would be completely different. It could be one small decision that leads us on a trajectory into a whole new realm and a whole new world that we never knew even existed had we not taken responsibility and made that decision at that moment. And Esther's moment was right now. And what's fascinating is that the Megillah is really in two parts. It moves from Mordechai calling the shots, telling Esther not to reveal her origins, telling Esther to be safe in the palace, to realize this is, and that she should go in and see Achashverosh and how to deal with Haman. But as soon as she takes on this extreme responsibility of not only her own mission, but the mission to save all the Jewish people, including Mordechai, she takes charge. She turns around to Mordechai and says, fine, I'll do it. You tell the Jewish people, they better fast and they better pray and they better get together, right? Because I can't do this alone. I need everyone. As the authors say in Extreme Ownership, and the Torah tells us, it can never be one. You're always part of a team. We're a klal. We're a unified people. Which is why when Haman describes us, he says, Am echad, there's one nation, mufuzar mufurad, who are separate and spread out. And Esther says, you better, Mordechai, Kenoset Yehudim, you better get together, the Jewish people. You better get us together, because we can't do this alone. We need unity in order to be successful in our mission. Extreme responsibility doesn't mean you are alone. It means you are taking the responsibility and the leadership over your people. That was the secret to Esther's success. She made sure everyone fasted. She made sure everyone prayed, so that when she walked in, she wasn't walking alone. She was walking in with hundreds of thousands of other people who had her back at that moment. That is the secret to Mordechai and Esther's success. There's another aspect to take on extreme responsibility. And that is sometimes, not only like Mordechai and Esther, you don't want to do it. You get taken against your will. And not only should you take the blame, which Adam and Eve did not do, which Cain, when he killed Abel, did not do, but sometimes, my friends, you just have to jump in and get the job done, not knowing what the results are going to be. A strong aspect of extreme responsibility is you take on the responsibility without knowing the end of the story, not knowing where this whole movement, this whole chain of events is going to end up. We learn this from one individual, someone who is not mentioned explicitly in this story, is mentioned elsewhere, but not mentioned explicitly when it comes to this story. And that itself is a lesson. Sometimes people taking extreme responsibility are visible and seen, and it's apparent. And sometimes, like Esther, or like the next person we're going to look at, Nachshon ben Aminadav, they're hidden behind the scenes and they're under the story and not the face of the story. And maybe that's part of their success. Everyone's looking for honor and recognition. When you take extreme responsibility, that doesn't always come. And Nachshon ben Aminadav is proof of that. And we know when the Jewish people left Egypt, 7 days after the Exodus, they stood at the Yam Suf. And the Egyptians were right behind them. And to the right and left was a hostile desert environment. But they were trapped. And we know that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And there was a strong easterly wind the whole night before that turned the sea to damp land. And then the water split. But the Gemara in Sotah tells us there's a hero to our story that is not mentioned. Because his extreme responsibility was not mentioned for everyone to see. And his name was Nachshon ben Aminadav. And the Gemara tells us that he was a man of extreme faith. And by the way, belief in yourself and belief in the people you're leading is a key component to be successful in your extreme responsibility, say the Torah sources. Nachshon ben Aminadav had great belief in God and himself. And he walks into the Yam Suf, into the Red Sea, and the water went up to his ankles. And he walked in further, and it went up to his knees. And he walked in further, it went up to his chest, went up to his neck, up to his chin, over his mouth. He was about to go in to cover his nose. And the sea split. In the merit of this hidden, righteous, extreme act taken on by Nachshon ben Aminadav. You know, I led a trip to Israel a number of years ago. We went to a base, an army base. This was an extremely dangerous area we were in. We were over the Green Line. And these individuals, these brave soldiers, were protecting surrounding towns from hostile elements among the local Arab population. And the name of this town, of this brigade, this Plukta, was Nachshoni. The Nachshoni Brigade. And I had a whole group of students, and I said, how do you get the name Nachshoni? Was there a general or a captain here called Nachshon? And he said, no. He says, we're named after Nachshon ben Aminadav in the Torah. He was the one who went into the water, he told me. I'm like, yeah, I'm a rabbi, I know. So why did he take his name? He says, because we have a mission in our army base. When it comes to protecting our people, which in this case are the towns around us, we need to take extreme responsibility. And the way to do that is to be the first ones in. Don't react to the situation. Get in there before the situation even becomes a problem. So we call ourselves the Nachshoni Brigade. We are the people who just jump in. Now, if there's anyone who's taking responsibility for our people right now in the land of Israel, it's the people like this, our brave soldiers, who are the first in, the Nachshoni people. The people who take extreme responsibility in order to help others. And once again, I want to be clear over here. There is a lesson we learn from God himself, that when it comes to leadership and taking responsibility, maybe the leadership position has landed on your lap. In Esther and Mordechai's case, almost against their will. They didn't choose it. It was thrust upon them. However, God taught us something very fascinating. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says that God says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. God hadn't created mankind yet. So he said, let us make man. And the commentators, including Rashi, says, who is the us? There is no us. Mankind hadn't even been created yet. So who is the us? So the commentators say something fascinating. He was actually talking in the plural because he was including the angels. God, whatever this means, consulted with the malachim, with the angels, before he created man. And Rashi says, why would he do that? Why would he consult? God doesn't need to consult with angels for making man. Angels weren't involved in this process. What was the secret over here? And Rashi says something fascinating. He says this was there for one reason and one reason only: to teach mankind that in order to be successful in leadership, when it comes to taking responsibility, the greater person, the leader, should always consult with others below them. So the concept of taking extreme responsibility is actually mirroring what God does in creation. But in order to do that, you cannot do it alone. Always include other people with you, even if you don't need them. Even if you don't, and that's a sign of humility. And one of the principles we mentioned earlier in this book of extreme ownership, where I'm taking our extreme responsibility ideas from, is the idea that you cannot do it alone. Okay? As King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, in Kohelet, two are better than one. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falls, because he has no one to help pick him up. You cannot do it alone, and you're not expected to. So extreme responsibility comes in a number of forms. Not blaming, not shirking a responsibility, taking on full responsibility for the situation that you may have not chosen, or maybe you did choose it, but it became extreme without you even realizing. And so we all take responsibility, but sometimes it becomes so extreme that to some degree it almost becomes life-threatening, whether physically threatening, emotionally threatening, psychologically or spiritually. And yet if that's what we've been called up for, we learn from Moses, we learn from Mordechai, we learn from Esther, we learn from God himself, and for another time we learn from King David, and we're going to learn from Mashiach as well, that responsibility must be taken. Because for leadership to be effective, it's about the future. But in order to win it, it's got to be about the present, making the right decision right now. Okay, my dear friends, wishing you all a beautiful Purim. May this be the last Purim we have in Galut, in exile. Thank you all for joining, and we'll pick this up, God willing, next week. Thank you.